which is the second you decide to interact with the medicine is when your integration starts. And I think that's really important to understand, because integration is about building a relationship with the medicine and with yourself. And so the second you internally say, okay, I'm making this decision to sit with this medicine, that's kind of when the work starts, and it kind of carries through. That's one thing that's really important. The other thing that I've seen in terms of preparation is
Welcome to Wendy Goes Deep. I am Wendy, and today I have Linden Schaffer with me. Now, I'm lucky. I live in Los Angeles, and so does this beautiful woman. And I have had the opportunity to meet her in person and work with her and seen her magic in action. And so I'm excited to bring her on today because we are going to get juicy into the topic of creating safe psychedelic spaces. So, if you don't know who Linden is, let me tell you a little bit about her. She is an award winning wellness entrepreneur and best selling author who brings 20 plus years of experience in wellness and psychedelics to early stage startups and small businesses. She's dedicated to creating a safe, supportive, and informed spaces. And she has also founded Reveal, which is an online global women's community. She co leads the Los Angeles Women's Psychedelic Community, which I am a part of, and is on the team of the Global Psychedelic Society. And I am ecstatic to talk to her today. So, welcome, Linden.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm so excited to be here, and just wanted to say that it's a pleasure having gotten to know you through our local community. And I am calling in today from Santa Monica, which actually sits on Tongva land.
I am in Tongva land too. I'm not too far from you. Thank you for bringing that up. It's funny. I'm so connected to the land here, just personally. I wasn't born here, but I have spent a lot of time understand like living in different areas over here with the um, different spaces and kind of learning the weather. And I've always felt this deep, connection, but I do sometimes forget to ask or give praise credit, to the indigenous people here. So thank you so much for doing that. Um, that actually kind of leads into kind of like how I met you. It is actually in my journey of kind of wanting to understand better about the plants that grow locally that led me into learning about botanicals being a healing modality, not just going to the doctor and getting medicine, which then led me to learning about psychedelics as a healing modality. And mine was a very solo path in discovering everything, and it took a long time before I started getting into like group settings. And that's primarily because I've had a lot of things in my past where I didn't feel safe. And I was very happy to find the women in psychedelics as a place and a space to, come and talk about things and feel safe. So, what brought you into kind of the world of psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story, right? I've lived many years at this point, and thank you for sharing your path. I think it's important to acknowledge that everybody's path is different, and what really binds us when we get into community is the respect and non-judgment of how each of us got here, and then how our lived wisdom can support everybody's journeys. And so for me, I guess, when we talk about women in community, which is really what I'm focused on these days, I could go back to like middle school and tell you that I never really fit in where I grew up. And I specifically never really fit in with women. I don't know if it was just kind of the 80s in the US where or if it's just kids, right? Women weren't always the friendliest at that age. I think, hormones and fitting in and all these things, right, have to do with it. And so for me, I always had like one best friend, and then we would kind of pop in and out of different communities, or really just be alone. And so it was important to me as I became older and an adult, like, how do I cultivate women's communities that do feel safe and supportive? And in psychedelics specifically, I've never been a huge drinker of alcohol. Alcohol does not really agree with me. And I moved to New York City at 18, and discovered myself and my passions. And it was at that time I started experimenting with psychedelics instead of alcohol. And so for me, my psychedelic path has been a very long journey, and it's been incredible because initially it wasn't an intentional space, which is how I interact with psychedelics today. It was recreational, which I find also extremely useful. And it was also a different time, and so the medicines themselves at that time were newer, and some of them were newer and safer than you can find today. And so, it being recreational discovery, there wasn't a lot of safety or harm reduction included in that. One, because I was young and didn't know any better, and two, because it wasn't something that was openly talked about in these kind of circles. And so, as I got older, and was using these medicines for healing, using them more intentionally, using them in my relationship with my partner, your relationship with them changes. And so I would say, let's see, about 15 or so years ago, I launched my first company, which was a wellness hospitality company. And it was at that point, as I brought groups together to travel the world to learn from indigenous cultures and other wellness practices around the world, that I started to see it was really women that gravitated to these spaces. And so creating a safe, supportive space for women, regardless of the time and point in their life that they're in. The thread that brought us all together is we were all seeking something. And so the question became, regardless of anybody's background, what they were seeking, how they were seeking it, how do we create this safe, supportive space? And so, since moving to the LA area about 5 years ago, and really the pandemic time, which really opened up a lot of the focus on the mental health crisis that we have here in the United States specifically, and talk of psychedelics sort of rising at the same time, I said to myself, I can help in this space. I have the experience and wisdom of almost 15 years of creating transformational experiences without psychedelics, and really seeing how preparation and integration goes into those experiences. Now you're adding plant medicine and other psychedelic compounds to this area. I have the tools on how to support. And so it came together in LA during this time. My co founders of the LA Women's Psychedelic Community, we wanted to create a space for women because us as women in this space, we're having trouble finding community ourselves to go to. So we're like, okay, it's time for us to create it for ourselves, and kind of see where this goes. And that's how my other company, Reveal, also came out of that, because the Women in Psychedelics community in LA, we meet in person once a month, but people wanted to stay connected beyond that. And so that's how the online community came to be, is so that people could continue this support and integration and holding safe spaces, even if we didn't have the opportunity to always be in person with each other.
I can attest to the amazing healing, um, benefits of being in community with people when you feel safe. It's interesting, hearing you talk about how you had the tools and everything to help create the psychedelic spaces, because I'm actually pretty, in comparison to a lot of people, yourself included, I'm fairly new into the psychedelic space. However, I came from sex education background. And the one thing that the the kind of the world that I come from over there, it's very consent driven. It's very much about, what are your needs? What are your boundaries? Let's create a safe container. And at least that's how I got involved. I know not everyone gets the same route into, that world, but my particular path into that world was through this very consent-based, um, language and communication. And when I started going into the psychedelic spaces, which by the way, it was actually because of a coaching client who had asked me about microdosing with her medication. And I didn't know. I was starting to look at other botanicals already at that point. So I was already starting to have an awareness. And so that's what it's actually that one question brought me all the way over here. And in me trying to find places like, well, how can I learn about this? How can I, find a safe place? Like, oh, I know over in the sex, community, like if they talk about consent in general, you're going to have a safer experience than when you go over to a space where consent isn't even mentioned. And in psychedelics, there isn't like a kind of a green flag that you can follow, so to speak. And especially as a woman, you have you are in more vulnerable positions oftentimes than men. Not to say that men aren't vulnerable too, but just biologically and societally, the way things are set up, uh, it was bit of a deterrent to get involved into some of the psychedelic groups and communities that you'd start hearing about because it's still all underground and a lot of people can't talk about it. So thank you for creating a safe space to talk about. Are you, like it's hard because I know a little bit about you, but so for the people who don't. So in talking about Reveal, how is like the space for community? Is your focus more on building the community? Is it more on the harm reduction? Like how are you, blending it together, or what's your primary objective over there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think community and harm reduction go hand in hand, right? Community is harm reduction, and to your point of a lot of this world kind of being underground, this was another reason why creating Reveal was very important to me. Because while I am not a guide and I don't serve medicine, my whole idea behind preparation, integration, harm reduction, and ethics is about creating these safe spaces. And so, therefore, I need to know guides and understand how they work. And I also need to understand people who are interested in a journey and what is putting them in this position of, hey, I want to enter an altered state of consciousness and I want to do it in a way that's going to make me feel safe, and I don't know where to start. And so that's how I see my role in this space, is sort of bridging that gap between what we call either the seeker or the journeyer and those who guide or sit or practitioners or therapists, right? However you want to call it, kind of bridging that gap, because I do know from being in a lot of the professional settings, we can be very siloed in these different ways. And really bridging the gap is what's keeping everybody safe. And so with Reveal, in particular, when you talk about creating safe spaces, right? A lot of what goes into that safe space is education, and honoring where these medicines came from and what they can do. And so, at the beginning of this conversation, we mentioned the indigenous land that we sit on. If we think back to kind of these plant medicines and the fact that they've been used for thousands of years in different contexts, um, most of the setting thousands of years ago was in community, right? People lived in community. And so this is how they kept each other safe, right? Oftentimes, an elder in the community would be the person that either took or served medicine. And those around in the community grew up, even if you weren't participating in medicine itself, understanding and viewing and visualizing and being living in this space where things were happening, right? And so you had kind of by osmosis, if you will, this understanding of how these medicines worked. And so that's a little bit what we try to replicate in community, whether it's in person or with Reveal. With Reveal itself, what we try to do in that space is every month we have a specific theme, kind of what's going on in the space, or if there's something specific people want to talk about. So, for example, in February, our theme was risk reduction. And so we talked about things like consent and informed consent. And we do this in many different ways. And oftentimes it's through hosting virtual events where the community kinds of comes comes together to talk about either their experiences or how they've dealt with specific situations. And it's really the opportunity to share both education and learnings, right? Because it's these kind of lived wisdoms of how we keep this community safe. And in a community like Reveal, it's an invite only vetted community, and it's how you build trusted relationships, right? The more you work with people, the more, even if you're just in conversation with people, you build that trust. You kind of get, to use our LA word, you get a vibe from people, and you can kind of decide, does that match your energy and how you're feeling? And I think it's really important to bring up some of the points you talked about in terms of like red flags, green flags, trusting our intuition. I think these are things that, as women specifically, growing up, at least in the time that we grew up in, we in general, women were taught to be people pleasers, to ignore some of our instincts, right? And so being in this type of community helps us get our power back, empower us in those ways, and empowers us to make more informed and safe decisions.
Yeah. Um, it's interesting in what you were talking about this, like at the end of this and at the beginning of this, there is a common thread. So like at the beginning, you were talking about how the setting was the indigenous people and people grew up like watching it. And then how in this new setting of Reveal, people are, being exposed to, you know, being in a different way, like in a new way, maybe not in the people pleasing way, in that more empowered, uh, in consent with yourself way. And that just kind of matches like neurobiologically how we're designed. And, there's the set and setting that you hear all the time, and people kind of, I think people take that setting as very literal, as in, okay, am I going to be sitting on a chair or laying down? Is there music? Is there a blindfold? And really, the kind of the to me, the biggest part of setting is the people that are around you and the state of their nervous system, because we regulate with each other's nervous systems. And if that setting that you are putting yourself in is with people who are, maybe they're experts, maybe they're highly, highly trained, but if they haven't done the work to keep themselves regulated when someone else is stressed, which I see all the time, like this is actually one of the reasons why I'm not a therapist. I thought about being a therapist, and for certain reasons at the beginning, I didn't, because here in California, you can't give someone a hug if you're a therapist. It's technically unethical, or like it goes against the standards. Um, and when I deal with people talking about very vulnerable, sexual history past, and sometimes they just need a hug and to not feel broken and that they're alone. And so to me, that was just a no. But then as I've gotten through this, I can't count the amount of times I've had clients call me up because they were basically re-traumatized by a therapist, where, you know, as a person kind of looking into the scenario, the common thread, they're all, very different scenarios, but the common thread was that the therapist was trying to fix the other. At the end of the day, the therapist was trying to fix the other person instead of truly holding space. The therapist was not regulating their nervous system, and therefore the other person didn't feel safe. And that is the like kind of the crux of the work that I do, is helping people feel safe. So that's one of the reasons why I was excited to have you on and to talk about this community and talk about how important it is to create that proper setting for both yourself and the environment. Um, are there, you talked about like the risk reduction. Is that mostly your focus over in Reveal, or is it? I mean, there's so many parts to the psychedelic experience that create that setting, honestly.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Um, yeah, I mean, the way that I look at Reveal is the risk reduction and harm reduction aspect is just an all encompassing, like, you need that to be the foundation in order for any education to happen out of it. Right. And so, Myself, I have some certifications in harm reduction and ethical practice, which I think is really important as the person that's holding space and setting some guidelines, right? This is a community driven effort. So everyone participates. The topics that come up or the resources that are shared are based on the community, but you have to have that ground foundation very solidly built. That being said, we're all human, we're not perfect. Everybody has room for growth and transformation. And I think in order for a community to be open and safe, people all have to acknowledge, like, hey, I'm here for feedback. I'm not going to do everything perfectly. Something I say or do might land one way with one person and a completely different way with someone else, based on, like you said, your history, your trauma, whatever you're bringing to the space. So I think it's very important that everyone who comes into the community acknowledges, like, I'm here to contribute, but I'm also here for feedback, right? As long as it's done respectfully. And so in Reveal, we focus on everything from education to reducing stigma and myths to empowering ourselves. Being in community, we talk a lot about, you talked about set and setting, but we also need to talk about preparation and integration. And a lot of that does happen in Reveal itself. I think sometimes there's not enough focus in the psychedelic space on these things, especially from the journeyer or the seeker. I think a lot of people recently, because psychedelics and plant medicine have been in the news so much, whether it's celebrity endorsements or new studies coming out or the FDA approving certain modalities for psychedelic assisted therapy. Because the lineages have been underground a lot, more so than they've been above ground recently. I think people look at psychedelics and are coming to psychedelics in sometimes in a very desperate situation, right? Medicine hasn't worked for them. Other wellness modalities haven't worked for them. And so they're on this cycle of like, I need something, this magic pill or whatever it is to fix me now. And they kind of skip over preparation, setting, the evaluation and assessment of it. And there's plenty of trained guides and therapists out there who will focus on those things. But there's also many people who won't. I'm sure you've been in situations or heard of situations where someone goes into the jungle in Peru and sits for an ayahuasca ceremony, and they come home and all of a sudden they're like, okay, I'm now serving ayahuasca. And that's not really how it's supposed to work. And so I think it's up to a place like Reveal to educate people, to provide resources such as, like, here's a list of questions to ask a potential facilitator. And not even while the questions themselves are important, you also have to tell your journeyer, like, how is the guide that you're asking these questions to responding? Are they willing to answer these questions? If they're not, like, that's a red flag. If they're uncomfortable answering these questions, that can be a red flag, right? And so there's a lot of nuance to this. And the hope is, in a community like Reveal, we can give this information and education out. We can provide this kind of support. We have experts in our community on certain medicines. We have experts in the community that have been practicing for a long time, and they have knowledge on, like, medicine contraindications and health contraindications, which I think is also super important, right? It's not just about making sure the medicines you're taking are safe and clean and that, but do you as a practitioner or as a seeker have high blood pressure, or do you have history of certain mental illnesses in your family, or whatever it is? Like, these are things that, if you're in a desperation stage and someone who's not very well trained is willing to just serve you a medicine, this is what leads to challenging experiences, and even can be extended challenging experiences. And so coming together in community and sharing our collective wisdom is really the key of what Reveal is about.
Yeah. I love how prefaced the preparation integration in kind of the same way where people talk about the setting, where, like, okay, what is the what is the space actually looking like? And they think about setting just on a very surface level. I see the same kind of thing like with preparation, like, oh, I'm going to do this plant medicine or this medicine with this dose, and I'm going to have, my blindfold and my blanket. And they're kind of thinking on like the surface level of the preparation versus the, what are the things that are going to come up for you, right? Like, I don't know, to me, preparation is more about like really getting clear on intention, not a goal, right? What's like your intention? What do you want to learn from this? What do you want to take away from this? And and there's just so much room for growth and expansion in that preparation phase to even begin with, that I think a lot of the issues would they would be a lot less if the preparation was like, more intensive. And then the other thing, when you talk about the integration, integration is not just the day after. I mean, the day after is a part of integration. Is there, like, what is, at least I have my kind of idea of what integration means. I'd love to hear what you think of, or what integration means to you, because I think this is also another problem. Like, the terminology isn't
Yeah.
clear. Like, we each hear a word and then we have our own interpretation of that word.
Yeah. And I think, there's 2 points that I want to mention as we get into deeper into what integration means. The first thing that I want to mention is something that a guide said to me once, which has stayed with me, which is the second you decide to interact with the medicine is when your integration starts. And I think that's really important to understand, because integration is about building a relationship with the medicine and with yourself. And so the second you internally say, okay, I'm making this decision to sit with this medicine, that's kind of when the work starts, and it kind of carries through. That's one thing that's really important. The other thing that I've seen in terms of preparation is I've had many people, message me or get on the phone with me and say, okay, I decided I'm going to sit with psilocybin, which is mushrooms. And the one of the questions I ask is like, what drew you to that medicine? And many times people are saying like, because it's trendy and I've read about it and da da da. That doesn't mean that's the medicine for them, right? And I think it takes a skilled person who's worked with multiple medicines to understand, what is it this person is trying to accomplish, right? Are they trying to solve something? Are they just doing this for expansion? What is it? Because again, your intention is very important. It doesn't mean it's going to be the thing that comes up in the medicine, but it's from a starting place. Again, this is how you create a container of safety. Why do you want to do this? And what is it you think you're going to get out of it? Is a good place to start before you even decide to sit with any kind of medicine. The other thing that I think that's really important when it comes to medicines, and I do not actually see a lot of guides talking about this, so I'd be interested to hear your experience as well, is, for example, if someone comes to you and says, hey, I want to sit with X medicine because I have anxiety or depression, and I think this, nothing else has worked, and I think X medicine will work for me. The question that's not asked enough is, sitting with the medicine might, in the beginning, make those symptoms worse. Are you okay with that? Because sometimes things get worse before they get better. And the quote unquote better part is where the integration comes in. And if you
Mhm.
are working with a seeker or a client who hasn't thought about that, this can create extended challenges on the other end. If that what they're trying to heal or fix or work with gets worse, it can lead to a bad place if people are not prepared for how they integrate, right? When it comes to integration, I think it's important to have that, as my guide said, integration starts when you decide to sit with the medicine. Before you even go into any kind of ceremony, what does your integration plan look like, right? It's recommended, whether it is with the guide that you sit with, although that can be ideal, or some other integration specialist. It's recommended that you do your first quote unquote integration session 2 days after the medicine session. And that's because a lot of stuff can come up. And you need to be able, if nothing else, to talk through it with somebody who has held this kind of space before and who could resource you.
You- I was going to say, I want to jump in real quick because uh, this is tied completely to this. This is the thing that is missing from the psychedelic space that is absolutely present in consent based, sexual experiences, whether that's BDSM or, different things. It is part of the community or the ethos of the check-in. So like in particular, like BDSM, you have a scene, you have the immediate aftercare, but it is kind of like a standard practice for people who are well educated in this, that within a day or two you actually check in, you have another check-in to go over everything, to debrief and figure out like what came up for you, because right afterwards you're feeling all kinds of things. Your neurochemistry is altered and it's in a different state. And then as things start to settle, things that maybe came up that you repressed during the experience because you were having a different sensation and your attention was directed elsewhere, or maybe things seemed overwhelming during the experience, and so you maybe you shut some things down too because you didn't want to go there. Like there's so many things that can come up when your neurochemistry shifts. And this is something that we like those of us over in sex education are very, very aware of. That I that's why that's kind of why I said, like, from the beginning, there isn't the same kind of language and understanding over here in the psychedelic. I think there's a inherent understanding, but it's not talked about very much. So I love that you're absolutely love that you're bringing that up. And then I have a couple other things to say about other things too. But keep going on with the integration part, because yes, debriefing is like essential anytime you alter your
Yeah,
neurochemistry.
thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. And I do think that the psychedelic space can learn a lot from the BDSM community in terms of consent, right? Because in that community, it's something that is talked about and it's understood by everybody. And I think that is a lot of what can be lacking in the psychedelic community. So many guides that I've talked to or in my network say that they will not work with a client who doesn't have an integration plan in place. And so again, these are things that are talked about during the preparation session. And integration, um, I think of integration as a wellness toolbox, right? And this is something that I've been developing for 30 years, right? You think of it as a toolbox where you're constantly adding tools and then you're taking out tools when you need them. And integration, I think it's hard to define because it is different for everybody, but that's why it's important to have a toolbox of all these different tools, right? So, talk therapy or just talking in community can be one tool. It helps you process from your rational mind kind of what happened, what you're thinking. It gives you people to reflect back to you, which I think is really important. It could be very somatic. So we talk a lot about somatics in the psychedelic space, meaning inherently kind of in your body. And I think a lot of people who work in the space of trauma or have had trauma or understand trauma know the famous book, The Body Keeps Score, right? And a lot of times when you're in an altered state of consciousness with psychedelics, it relaxes your rational brain so that your body and your physical being can release some of whatever it's been holding on to. So somatically, integration can look like breath work. It can look like yoga. It can look like ecstatic dancing or dancing, right? It can look like body work. It can look like energy healing and energy release. So, again, not all of these techniques and modalities work for everybody, but what's really brilliant, and for me personally in my journey, what has made my psychedelic experiences, even ones that are hard, I've never had quote unquote a what we call a bad trip. And that's because I had 20 years of building a toolbox before I intentionally started using psychedelics. And therefore my body in a way knew what to rely on. It knew when I needed to talk to somebody about my experience. It knew when I needed to dance out my experience. It knew when I needed to sit in a room and just be by myself, or I needed to journal, or whatever, or I needed to watch a video to help me understand what was happening. The other thing that for me has been crucial that I learned through my wellness hospitality company is I think of these psychedelic journeys. I love this analogy that I've been using a lot, is like when you run a marathon, you don't just wake up and go run a marathon the day that, like, oh, I decided to run a marathon. There's training that goes into it, right? And I feel like that's the same for some of these psychedelic and wellness experiences, right? You need to make sure that you're building up, that you have that toolbox, that you have your set and setting. For me, I am fortunate enough and privileged enough that I have a bit of a flexible lifestyle, and so anytime I journey, I also know at minimum the day before and the day after, my calendar is completely clear because I don't know what's going to come up. And the last thing I want is to shuttle one way of consciousness directly back into like how I was before. Because for me, working with these medicines, you're trying to shift the way you are. You're trying to shift something. So if you go on this experience and you're here to shift something, and then you go right back into the same habits, the same everything that you've been doing, there can be a breakdown there, and that also can cause some challenging experiences. And so these are the ways when I think of integration, and I talk to people about integration, and I help people make their own integration plan. Like, it's important to talk about the breadth and the depth of what's available, and then let people know there's no one right way. It's how
Mm.
you will cope yourself. But I think it's important to point out, which you mentioned, integration isn't something that happens in like a week and then it's over, right? These experiences can be so deep, and sometimes you're not ready to process them right away. So I think it's super important that immediately you have an integration session where you're talking through these things, you're figuring out what works for you. But then oftentimes with specific guides, if they're doing like integration packages, like the very last integration session might be 6 months from now, because things are constantly coming up and shifting, and you have to create some room in your life to process those things.
There's so much that I want to like go through on what you said there. Um, the first thing is going to be that this is something that's like really, really integral to the work that I do. Uh, so I think you know this, but maybe you don't. But I started out as an orgasm coach, like that was my complete focus, right? And so I did not want to touch trauma. I'm like, I'm just gonna teach people techniques and all the things that need to happen so that way they can have orgasms. And then as I learned more about orgasms, they start and end in the brain, and they're actually a nervous system process. They're not biomechanical. And so that led me down like the years of learning about, the nervous system deeply, because my whole goal was to stay away from trauma. I wanted to teach people basically how to biohack their orgasm so they could like, not have to necessarily deal with the trauma in the moment and still be able to receive pleasure. That was kind of my goal. Like it wasn't a like an evading thing. I'm not saying like don't do the work, but it was more like, well, why can't you experience pleasure? You should be able to experience pleasure before you do all the work, right? Which led me to this really deep understanding of how everything, like all of life, depends on whether or not you're safe or not safe. And so when you were talking about like integration and the integration plan, one of the things I realized is that, kind of like you said, a lot of the people who are coming to psychedelics, they're very like, it's almost like a last resort. Not always, there's the psychonauts and different people who are there for different reasons, but a lot, at least the people that I work with, have a tendency to be coming to me because modern medicine has failed them in different directions. Sadly, I get a lot of people who have been injured from medical procedures and different things, so they're very apprehensive about going to doctors at this point. And what I've seen throughout the whole process is that people don't know how to create safety in their body. And like what you were talking about, the toolbox, that basically is what I do is like help people with all these little tools to create safety in their body. And when you have them, you can life is less when you have those tools, life is less chaotic and life is easier to like go with the flows, right? Because it's gonna ebb and flow. And those same tools work in the psychedelic space, which is what you were saying. And there's one comment that you made though about the body keeps the score that I was like, because it's a little bit different than my understanding of the biology. Um, you were talking about how like the logical part of the brain relaxes when you're on psychedelics. And when you actually go through like the mapping of the networks, there's the default mode network, which is like that kind of like the monkey mind. It's the thing, it's not just monkey mind, but it's the thing that helps us be able to do all the things automatically without thinking about it. It's the least energy intensive network, which is why we stay in it all the time because it's the easiest one for us to be in versus like the more complex thinking, which is like the precortical or not precortical, prefrontal cortex and the central executive network. And what the research shows is that the energy requirements from shifting from the default mode network to the central executive network go down. And so when you take psychedelics, in particular the serotonergic psychedelics, the research hasn't been done for some of the other ones. So we can't say yes or no. There's just no information to say that that is or isn't happening. But at least for the serotonergic, which is like your LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, um, I don't know. There's a couple more, but I don't know why I'm not remembering them off the top of my head. Um, anyway, so that kind of self-referential place of thinking where you're like all up in your head, which oftentimes we conflate with logic and thinking, right? But really, most of that is tied to this like fear-based self-referential thinking, which people get stuck in. The fear centers shift. They don't necessarily go down because you can still have like pretty intense experiences on the psychedelics, but it has a different perspective because now you're not stuck in that self-referential default mode. You're now going into more of a actually logical thinking without the same kind of monkey thought patterns being attached to it. So it allows actually a more flowing, because actually it's that state when you get into flow, you're using that part of the brain more. So you get into a more flow state of thinking instead of that, like hamster wheel. And so when you had said that, I was like,
Yeah, thank you.
I was like, I want to correct
Yeah.
it a little bit or just make it clear,
Yeah, thank you.
because
I appreciate the feedback and take the feedback and agree with everything that you've said. I myself don't have a research or scientific background, so I will apologize for the way I categorize things, but I think it's very important the distinction that you just made. So thank you.
yeah, remember said it was all about trying to get people to biohack their orgasms. I was going to write a book and then realized that half of what people talked about, the research actually didn't back it up. And that, put me on 5 years of reading like, you know, sometimes hundreds of research studies a day. Right. So, because I was like, I have to figure, because I can't trust now like what other people say, because sometimes they're right and sometimes they aren't. But how do you know if they're right or wrong unless you go into the research? So that's kind of where my brain is like, I'll go to the research now. But with that being said, it's also really important to note that the anecdotal evidence that's not a part of research is just as valid, and especially in the psychedelic space, because there's so much research that has not been done, and the research that can be done has really strict limitations because of the legality, the social norms, all of the things that are put on it. So there are, it's really kind of, you know, limited in scope in the way the research is. And really, so much of the information we know kind of goes back to that original thing. It's about the lived experiences and the shared experiences and the shared tools. Like if you think about all these tools that we're using, it's usually because either we discovered them themselves or we're learning from someone else who discovered them and has been sharing them. And it's this constant sharing of information and knowledge and how to work with our body, with ourselves, with the environment, with the medicines. And that is actually where, you know, the juiciness comes from,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I know there was another thing in there too that I wanted to mention, but now I can't remember. But I love, this conversation of, oh, I know what it was. It's still going back to body keeps the
Mm,
score. So then we were talking
mm,
about how when you're in these spaces, I talk about this a lot in other things that I do. And so I will always I try to use my same terminology because that way, at least if you're listening to me, you know what I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about something different. There's a body snapshot and a memory snapshot that gets combined together when we go to sleep at night to process the events of the day. And so the body snapshot is literally every signal that's coming up from your body. Like just think of everything, like the neuro, the chemistry, the body positions, all of the information that's coming out from the body, it gets paired with an event. And when something triggers that body snapshot, your brain retrieves the memory snapshot. When something retrieves the memory snapshot, your brain retrieves that body snapshot. And that is where the healing kind of comes in place. And this is why somatic practices are so essential, because if the part that's getting triggered, that memory is going to come through. And if the memory is getting triggered, your body's going to come true. And it's about learning these different modalities to like work, have them work together. That's why talk therapy alone is, we know it's good and useful although I have some ideas as to why that actually aren't related so much to the talk therapy. But we know that it's pretty useful to talk things out, right? And we also know that somatic therapy is really good, but there has to be that integration. And that to me is like really what integration is. Integration is like taking the sensations, the emotions that you're experiencing with the thoughts that you're having and putting them together in a way that's more useful in your life.
yeah,
So,
I think, like you said, having this toolbox of all these different modalities is what helps people. And like you said, each person is different and each person is bringing different things to their experience. Even if you just look on like a genetic level, right? We're all different. And so these medicines are going to interact with you in different ways. Yes, there are some norms that we can say, based on either research, or if you have a guide who works with a specific medicine and has been serving that specific medicine for a number of years, they can pull out patterns, right, from this anecdotal evidence. But it doesn't mean that it's going, like, there's a blueprint for how this is going to land in your body or how it's going to be processed. And so that's why it's important to sort of have this buffet of options to choose from.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's like the crux of it, right? And I think talking about the harm reduction part that we've been talking about this whole time, it's really about kind of bringing in all these pieces together so you can create the safest environment. And when you create the safest environment, just on a neurobiological level, that's when the most healing occurs. um, for people who really are looking to use this as a modality for healing, like you want to get the best and most out of it, learn the things that are going to help make you feel the safest, and you will, get like your body will heal. Your body naturally knows how to heal itself. However, you have to create the setting for that
Yeah.
healing. Oh, that actually kind of ties into what I was going to say about the therapist. Part of the reason why I think talk therapy is beneficial, I've said this before in multiple places, so I'm going to say it again because it's going to click with someone, and if it's the first time you're hearing it, um, when you go in every week or on a regular basis into a therapist's office, hopefully, and more often than not, the therapist is going to be in a more regulated nervous system state. that's what they're trained to do. This is their job. They feel comfortable doing it. Their office, their thing is safe to them. So they have like a safe bubble around them, and they are now a more or less safe container for the person coming in. And so, week by week, or, you know, time after time after time, someone who's dysregulated is going into a place where even if they didn't talk, even if all the, actually, I honestly, I think even if they didn't talk and just sat there, there'd probably be more healing done. um, where getting that nervous system regulated, right? And then the good parts about therapy and the integration and the coaching and all that stuff happens when you're able to talk about something and get back to that regulated nervous system state. That's the healing power. It's not the talking about it. It's about getting your nervous system dysregulated and practicing coming back to regulated state. And that's one of the reasons I personally think psychedelics are so helpful for so many people. Because if you've never had that body experience of safety, of regulation, you can talk all you want. You can go to do these different things, but if your body has not experienced like true regulation, from your childhood, from your biology, your epigenetics, whatever the circumstances that have led to, you can't get there until you get there. And psychedelics do provide this pathway towards regulation, um, which actually then allows you to bring up the stuff to heal.
Yeah. And I
Right.
think it's a very important point. And I think again, for someone who is trying to find the right guide or psychedelic assisted therapist or whomever practitioner they work with, I think it's important for this to be sort of that preparation question, right? If the guide or therapist isn't asking like about your nervous system and regulation, then you as the seeker should say, bring it up. Have you dealt with this before? What have you done to get people regulated again? Because I think there's a lot of, again, in this training of serving plant medicine, there are trainings out there that talk about this and teach about this. And then there are trainings out there that don't. And like you said, because this kind of stuff can come up in different ways, oftentimes I think it's great if you find a guide or a therapist that says, look, your nervous system, based on the conversations we've been having, is too dysregulated right now to go into a medicine journey. So, first, we need to get your nervous system a little more regulated. And again, it's a spectrum. So, whatever that means for that specific person. But sometimes that's how you create that safety. And that's how you make sure the integration is going to quote unquote work, right? Because if someone goes into a medicine space completely dysregulated, and the guide doesn't know how to deal with that or talk to that, that is a situation, right, where more harm is caused. And it's not necessarily
Yeah.
intentional, but these are the kind of things that can happen.
You know, I've been fortunate that I've worked with such a wide variety of people with such wide backgrounds and varied histories. And I feel very honored because people have felt very safe to share things with me. I mean, some of the things that people have done, society, really would be putting them in, putting them away. And maybe they didn't get caught, doing the things that they've done. And if they had, they would maybe be in prison, right? Most likely they would be in prison. And so, but I've gotten a chance to know some of these people. And what I know just across the board is like humans are just doing the best they can, right? And a psychedelic guide, whatever their reasons for getting in there, you know, in general, it's because they're also doing like what they think is the best for them in their situation, which more often than not actually involves helping other people. They just may have a different way of helping other people than what other people find to be safe. Does that make
It,
sense?
it I
Um,
would caution and say that there's a lot of talk about that specifically right now in the ethical circles that I'm in. because
Yeah.
this idea of wanting to help somebody, there are lines and boundaries that need to be set, because
Yes.
the purpose of holding space and creating a safe space should be for the practitioner to create that safe container and then get out of the way so that the journeyer can have their experience. Oftentimes, what I've seen is if people aren't trained enough, or if they haven't done this enough, they can project their own experience. There can be transference. You can kind of want to get in and solve something for somebody. And so I think there
Mhm.
is it this is not a topic that's talked about enough.
I agree. So this is when I started to say this, I was I was basically leading up to what you're just about to talk to, like what you're talking to. As someone who comes over from the sex education side, and this is also relevant to the psychedelic side, unfortunately. If you're working with someone who has been in the swinger lifestyle for 15 years and is very sexually open and free, has really low anxiety levels with being touched and having, being, hit on, for lack of a better word right now, like coming up. Um, your approach with them is going to be very different than someone who is coming from, like, just starting to dip their toe into the space, who maybe has some sexual trauma that they haven't maybe even addressed, maybe they're not even acknowledging yet. They come from a family where, it was just like a quick little pat hug, if that, right? Like, some people come from families where touch just wasn't a part of their existence, so then you go to put your hand on their shoulder and they're like, oh my God, because they're in this like heightened state. And I think that, once again, kind of going back to those who are kind of trained in the BDSM and like sex education, we know, like, we learn this and we understand that people come from all these different places of what feels safe, you know? And until you have the conversation with someone about where is their line of safety, like learning, from the beginning, like, all right, let's start with the basics. And that's where I come from. I come from the place of, like, okay, no one knows how to feel safe in their body. No one knows anything. And if you come from that place, like, no one wants to be touched, no one wants, right? Like, and then work your way up, it's so much easier because I know some people who have been sexually traumatized, in situations by people of authority. And I know people who are in those authority positions who have unintentionally sexually harmed someone because they misread, and their frame of reference and their education wasn't there to to their frame of reference wasn't there, education wasn't there, and they misread the signals, and they were trying their best to, like, open someone up. Like, their intention
Mhm.
was to help heal the person, right? But it was not appropriate and it was harmful. And um it happens, like, it happens quite a lot, unfortunately, as as the because I'm open about sex education and sex, and I talk about trauma and all this stuff, whether I'm talking my business coaching clients or my orgasm and neuropleasure clients. I can't tell you how many people have come to me and told me about experiences where someone who was the authority in that situation, you know, uh, they were, like, either sexually assaulted or, sexually harassed. And it's and especially as women, we're taught to be people pleasers and just kind of, like, we have our different modalities to, like, navigate the situation, right? But most of the time people don't know how to, stand in their power and create that boundary and say no. And especially when you bring psychedelics into the equation, you're the it's a different
Yeah.
equation. It's 100% different equation. Even someone who's normally empowered often finds themselves unable to speak up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, and thank you for sharing. I also know that these are difficult topics and difficult subjects. And back to this idea that we've been talking about people pleasing. Um, Fireside Project has this amazing PDF of list of questions to ask a potential facilitator that you might be working with. And some of the questions on there, I believe, have to do with asking your guide, like, have you ever had a relationship with any of your clients, a sexual relationship with any of your clients? Have you ever been accused of anything like sexual assault or inappropriate touching? I know those are uncomfortable questions, but as you said, like, that's how we empower ourselves, by asking these questions. It's how we read the other person, how they respond and react to those questions being asked of them. I don't know if people are truthful in those situations. I have no idea. I can't speak for anybody's experience, but I think just even asking the questions and bringing them up starts to create a container of safety if you feel safe with the way the person answers those kinds of questions.
Yeah, exactly. Um, you know, I don't like what you're saying. I don't know if someone's like truthful, but I guarantee you their demeanor changes. When you truly know that you're a place for safety for someone else, your demeanor doesn't change with questions that are
Yeah.
uncomfortable. You're like, oh yeah, let me tell you about this, right? Like as because I know I'm safe. They're like, oh, here, let me tell you. This is what I provide. This is the container, right? Versus, oh, why are you asking me
Yeah.
that, right? Yeah. Um, at least at least that's my experience too. Like, I as someone who this is not a surprise to people who know me and watch and listen and are follow me on social media. I go to sex parties, and so I've had some really uncomfortable conversations and asked questions, and I trust that instinct of how people respond to the questions. And it's not even the words that they say half the time. It's just about like, oh, how did they react to that right now? You know, because it also teaches you whether or not they can handle the uncomfortableness. And if they can't handle the uncomfortableness of a question, how on earth are they supposed to handle me having an emotion that you know what I mean? Like I'm just asking a question, right? Like what and you wanted me to trust you to go do something else? No. Yeah. So I agree. I love that they have those questions. I will see if I can find them and put them in the show notes because I think that's a important
Yeah.
tool in the tool belt, right? Um, so any kind of last, burning questions, thoughts, ideas that have come up that you're like, I want to talk about this before we go.
I think in terms of just community, and being in community around psychedelics, we've been talking a lot about this throughout this conversation, but I think it's important to name that these communities are built on trust and deepening trust with each other. And so whether that is, seekers and guides and therapists coming together, or whether it's any subset of that, that's how these medicines, in my opinion, work better, right? When you're in a place that feels safe and you're with people that you trust, right? We started this conversation talking about like going into a group space with everyone's nervous system at a different level and all that kind of stuff. And so for me specifically, in my experiences, I've only journeyed in situations where I feel safe and there's trust. So whether that's alone by myself, whether that's with my partner, or whether that's people that I've known for a little while, almost every guy that I've ever worked with, I've had a few months of talking with before I go into a journey space with them. If that's not been the case, for example, I did go and work with an indigenous healer whose lineage is like this in Mexico. The person that connected us, I have a very trusting relationship with that person, and that person has sat with this healer, an indigenous woman, for many, many years. And so the person that connected us, we had a lot of conversations before I went into the scenario to know what to expect, and all of that, rather than just finding this person and going to sit with them without any kind of knowledge. And so I think community in general is, again, what keeps us safe. It builds this trust, and it allows for this open dialogue that will empower each of us. So I think it's important to talk about how to find
Yeah.
community, and I do think not everybody, but whether you're going into indigenous lineages or whether, let's say, you're traveling for a specific psychedelic experience, you have to remember that you, again, come home and kind of plug back into whatever life that you have. And so to have a community to fall back on, even if it's not in person, but it's something like Reveal where you can get online and say, this is what's coming up for me, to have this group that you feel comfortable talking to, sharing your experiences, or even asking for advice or feedback. Has anyone experienced X? You feel less lonely and you feel able to handle certain things that come up when you have a community to work with.
Yeah. I was recently in a conversation with a bunch of people talking about psychedelic experiences and talking about the different medicines and, you know, why people use the different ones. And one of the guys in the conversation was one of the guys in the conversation is a MDMA facilitator, right? The other one was talking about how their experience with MDMA was like one of the worst experiences of their life. And it was interesting, hearing this conversation and because we had this conversation and, I have my points, they have their points, like everyone has their like different lived experiences that we each have our different tools, right? To bring and what ended up happening was like this sharing of wisdom that now this MDMA facilitator is able to take and make it wasn't the same, by the way. Wasn't the same facilitator. But for example, because you had talked a little bit about knowing what those tools and those integration kind of pieces are in, the journey, out of the journey, all of that. If those were not discussed with this person who did the MDMA uh, therapy, and had it been, with someone that knew some of this language that we're talking about, some of these questions, had this person known these questions, it they probably wouldn't have done this particular MDMA, you know, journey. They would have found someone else to be able to facilitate it because what they realized in speaking in this conversation is that they didn't have the tools, the somatic experience. They didn't have enough somatic awareness to deal with what was coming up during the MDMA experience. Had the facilitator talked about their somatic experience, had the person who was doing it questioned them about like, what are you good, like what's the process when I start feeling uncomfortable? Because sometimes I feel uncomfortable with, intense experiences, right? And so this person was forced to lay down and stay stuck in their head instead of move their body. And like that was at the end of the day what ended up being, the big, thing. Had these conversations happened, it would have been a very, very different experience for this person. And so I thank you so much for having a community and having places for people to talk and to share and their wisdom, to come with their questions, to be vulnerable, all of the things that are required for us as, community to help and support each
Yeah,
other.
thank you. I think
So
it's important to acknowledge, like, we don't know what we don't know, right? So sometimes, how are we supposed to ask questions when we've never experienced an altered state of consciousness? We don't know how we're going to react in a certain situation. So I definitely think that's part of, having a list of questions. Whether you understand where those questions will lead is important, and also working with somebody who's done this, multiple times. There's a lot of really amazing guides and healers out there who sit in community with other facilitators. And so understanding, kind of like a medical doctor who has a residency, right? Like how many hours, how many ceremonies have you done, right? Because again, we all react differently. And so having knowledge and wisdom to bring to the table to answer questions and kind of these lived experiences will help people feel more safe and comfortable. There is a question of like how much preparation is too much preparation, right? Because you don't want to set expectations per se, or take the magic out of some of these experiences. So there is a fine line. And I think for people who are a little more practiced, you then can start to decide like these are the things that make me feel safe and make me feel good. And these are the things that I don't want to focus on too much because I don't want them to unexpectedly lead me in a certain way. And so, yeah, I think, but these are things that we don't know until we get into community and start asking and start learning from other people.
Yeah. It was interesting when you were talking about like the preparation and how you don't want these things. Kind of reminds me of, do you remember learning how to drive? I don't know
Mhm.
if you have a driver's
Yes.
license. um, I remember very distinctly like getting into the car and like doing that whole entire checklist, and I think I might have done it twice because I was nervous I missed something, and I was like, "Okay, here's the thing, here's the rearview mirror, here's this, here's that," like, in all of the things, like, "Okay, I'm gonna turn left, so I have to move the turn signal this way," like, all of that extra thought and energy and attention, and now I just, like, hop in the car and don't even think twice about it, right? But that comes with
Mhm.
experience, you know? And, I think we all get to that place, you know, in our own time. Like some people feel much more natural getting into the car the first time and don't need to run through the checklist twice, right? Or they're also, that's how we handle like our
Mhm.
stress, right? Like some people, like I want to try to prepare as much as possible to eliminate and reduce my uncertainty because that's what makes me feel better. And other people are like, no, I just rather like ignore all the possibilities of the things that will go wrong and just jump in head first. And not to say that one is right or wrong, but just knowing
Mhm.
that about yourself and being honest about what you need and want, right?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. All right. So, where can people find you? Because I'm certain that people are going to be interested in learning more about these different things that you've got going on.
Absolutely. So for Reveal, you can join our community and make sure that you add in there that Wendy Goes Deep referred you because we try to keep the community safe. But that website is revealcommunity.world, and we can share a link in the show notes for sure. And then you can find me if you're interested at lindenschaffer.com. That's Linden SCHAFFER.com. And that is my personal website. I'm a consultant in this space for various modalities. I also talk people through beginning experiences if they have a lot of questions and don't know where to go. Like I said, I've been seeped in this world for a little bit, and I feel like I'm resourced, so I can share. If people need therapists, or if they need integration specialization, or if they want to get their medical contraindications checked, I have resources, those kinds of things for people. Yeah, but I would love to connect with people in those ways. You can find Reveal on Instagram as well. So yeah,
Mm. Yeah, awesome. All right. So thank you so much. And I know I'll be seeing you soon.
thanks.
Bye. Say what you just said after I hit
Okay,
stop.
so I was thanking you for having this juicy conversation. And thank you for the feedback that you gave me throughout the episode, because I do think in this space, we're not having these conversations enough, right? People tend to be educated or experienced in a specific way, which is why I'm not a guide, right? I am a space holder and community builder because I don't know enough about this other side of the experiences. And so when you say to me, hey, I have X knowledge in this area and here's what I know and the feedback and reflections, it's amazing for me to say, this is a chance for me to learn and grow. And on the other side, when I have more experience in a certain situation, for me to say, this is my expertise. And I don't think these conversations are happening enough in the psychedelic space.
I absolutely agree. Like I've learned so much about having, from having you on right now, and even like the space holding and the community building, and you know that I it's awe-inspiring, right? Because here you are taking like your what you know to be good, and your strengths, and you're bringing them, to the table in a way that's not that's not what I do, right? And I'm just so thankful because I've learned so much from you and from these places that you've created. It's only been it was just last year when I started going, and I've already learned so much from every single time I show up. I learned so much from all the people who come, and everyone's got so much wisdom to share. Thank you for joining for today's episode. I hope you found the conversation interesting, maybe even a little inspiring. And if you're curious about how to work with our guest today, check out the show notes because I'll have all the links and resources there. And if you're curious about how to work with me or what I offer, you can check out my website, wendygoesdeep.com, to learn more about what it is that I do. And I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you for a little favor. Growing this community is only possible with support from people like you. If you could take a moment to like, subscribe, or maybe even share it with a friend, it helps more than you know. And until we can go deep again, stay curious and keep exploring.